Hi everybody, my name is Jenny Wilkins and thank you for joining today's webinar. Today we're going to go through a sample analysis focusing on the Harmonized ELSA from the Gateway to Global Aging data. We would like this webinar to be interactive, so if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, please feel free to use the question box or the chat box. There's also a handout provided for you, which is called Advanced ELSA Webinar August 2018.doc. You can download that in the Handouts section of the GoToWebinar panel. That's actually a Stata.do file, so you can download it and remove the C from the extension and run it in Stata. So now we're going to go ahead and get started. So we're first going to do an analysis using the Harmonized ELSA. Then we'll be comparing the results to several other European countries using the Harmonized Share. We're going to pick a research question to start with and get a feel for using the Harmonized ELSA. So in honor of the FIFA World Cup, we're going to be asking, are there differences in the frequency of vigorous physical activity between genders and across different age categories? We'll be looking at the frequency of vigorous physical activity and creating a new variable indicating whether the respondent participates in vigorous physical activity at least once a week. And we'll be looking at the frequency of vigorous physical activity across gender and age groups to see what kind of difference that makes. So the steps that we're going to go through first are, we're going to download or create the Harmonized ELSA dataset, and we're going to identify the relevant variables. We're also going to create some variables, mainly an indicator of weekly vigorous physical activity, and then we're going to apply weights. And we'll start looking at the mean of weekly vigorous physical activity in England by itself and across gender and age levels. So the first thing we're going to need to do is download the Harmonized ELSA data from the UK Data Service. If you'd like a direct link to the website, I suggest you visit the Gateway to Global Aging data. This can be reached at g2aging.org. That's the website that we maintain. It's a centralized resource for researchers looking to use these harmonized studies. Before you can download the data or harmonized dataset, you'll need to register for the UK Data Service and ELSA, and for each HRS sister study you're interested in. Let me take you to our downloads page. To register, you can go individually to each website using the links. Or for share in the other studies, you can use our brand new Universal Access to Study Data page by clicking here. You can select which studies you want to register for and get most of your registrations done at once. Once we've downloaded the Harmonized ELSA dataset, we can download the Harmonized ELSA codebook from the third row of the downloads page. Next, we want to identify our variables of interest. And since we'll be comparing it to share later on, we want to make sure they're comparable. It can be quite a task to find different measures that are comparable. So you could download the study questionnaires and look through them, but we've also built in a search function to the Gateway to Global Aging data and a couple of other helpful features for finding these comparable measures. So if we jump back to the Gateway website, we'll select the Surveys at a Glance tab on the top left. And here you'll see our recently updated survey page. We've just finished making some major improvements to make our website easier to use. So we could navigate through this table to look at the questionnaires by clicking ELSA Wave 7, which gives us the modules within the questionnaire, and then select Health, and we can start looking through this flowchart of all the questions, or we can look at a list of questions. But this probably isn't the easiest thing to do when you're just getting started. Instead, we can search by keyword. So since we're looking at vigorous activity, we'll type in vigorous, we'll look at ELSA and share, and search. And this will give us more information on variables from the original studies or the harmonized studies. You'll see variables from the harmonized studies related to that keyword, and then the questions from each year of ELSA and SHARE. You can also do a search of all the harmonized datasets by subtopic. So here I can select our harmonized ELSA and SHARE, and I'll limit our results to the year 2014. From the health section, I'll click physical activity or exercise. So here we'll see the harmonized variables for these two studies. You'll see that the variable naming convention is pretty simple. So the first letter in the variable is either an R, an S, or an H, meaning the respondent, the spouse, or the household. The following number represents the wave number. So for the ELSA, these are wave 7 variables. You can click on any of these to find out more information. Another way to find comparable variables is to look at our concordance table under the Concordance tab next to the Survey tab. Here you'll see that we have many different domains with tables showing comparability between different studies. So we're going to be looking at health, and we'll look at the health behavior table. We'll scroll down until we find vigorous physical exercise. We see that ELSA talks about vigorous exercise, and the SHARE question is a little more descriptive but still comparable. So this can be a really helpful place to get started. And then we also have the harmonized codebooks, which provide a lot of information. So once again, you'll go to the Downloads tab on the Gateway to Global Aging Data, and on the third row, you can download our codebooks. We offer codebooks for all of our harmonized datasets. I'll pull up the Harmonized ELSA codebook. As you can see, it's version E as of April 2017. And you can use the bookmarks on the left, and we'll look for health behaviors, physical activity, or exercise. As you can see, we have the name for each variable with labels and some brief descriptive statistics. And you can learn more about how the variable was created in the How Constructed section. And we also highlight any differences between waves or between the Harmonized ELSA and the RAND HRS. We always use the RAND HRS as the basis of comparison when creating the harmonized datasets. So if we go back to our research question, we're going to look at the frequency of vigorous physical activity across gender and age ranges. So we'll need to identify our selected variables from the Harmonized ELSA, and you can do this using the resources available from the Gateway website at g2aging.org. While ELSA and SHARE are longitudinal studies where they go back and re-interview people on an ongoing basis, we're going to be doing a cross-sectional analysis, meaning looking only at 1 year or 1 wave. So for our year of interest, we're going to look at 2014, which happens to be the 7th wave of ELSA, to do a cross-sectional study and sort of get a snapshot of physical activity. For ELSA, the person identifier is called IDAUNIQ, and the frequency of vigorous physical activity is R7VGACTX_E. The respondent's age in 2014 is called R7AGY. The respondent's gender is called RA gender, and we have our individual analysis weight in R7C weight resp. So we're going to start to use Stata now. And remember that in the handouts we have that .doc file, which is really a Stata do file that we're going to open up. So we'll open that up in the do file editor within Stata. So that's this little notepad with the pencil here. If you're unfamiliar with Stata, I'd encourage you to follow along. A lot of the commands will be similar if you're using a different statistical package like SAS, SPSS, or R. We do have some samples of a similar analysis in SAS that we provide, which I'll show you how to find at the end of the webinar. So I'm going to open up this program, which is called Advanced ELSA Webinar August 2018.do. And if you're following along, you'll need to edit lines 5 and 6 of the program to say where your data files are coming from. One other thing you'll notice about the program is a command called pause. So what this will do is we can stop the program at different points, and we can look at the output that Stata has given us and then continue to move on. So we can execute or run this do file by clicking this notepad with the arrow on the top right. So here we can see that we've run this do file to our first pause, and when we're ready to continue, all we need to do is type Q and enter, and the program will continue running. So I'll bring up the commands on the slides where it's a little easier to see, and then we'll jump back to Stata to look at the output. So the first thing we want to do is read in the observations and variables from the Harmonized ELSA. We employ the command use because we're going to use this dataset and bring it into Stata. Stata works by building a dataset in its memory, which makes it fast, but it needs to be brought into Stata memory first. So we're going to use the variables we identified using the Harmonized ELSA dataset. While we're at it, we're going to create generate a new variable called ISO country and assign it a value of 826, so we know that these observations come from England. 826 is the 3-digit numeric country code assigned to the UK by the ISO. So if we jump back into Stata, we type Q and enter, we can see we've did this, and we typed a tab for ISO country. You can see that we have over 18,000 observations in the ELSA dataset. While we're here, we'll run a tab for our vigorous activity variable to see what this looks like. So we can see that this is a categorical variable with codes of 2 through 5 representing options of more than once per week, 1 to 3 times per month, and hardly ever or never, which happens to be the category most people fall into. So why don't we try to look at whether they do vigorous physical activity at least once per week? To do that, we're going to recode the existing variable, which is R7VGACTX_E. So we'll assign the existing values of 2 and 3 with a value of 1, meaning they do vigorous exercise at least once a week. And we'll assign the existing values of 4 and 5 with a value of 0, meaning they don't do vigorous exercise at least once a week. And we'll give this recoded variable a new name and call it R7VigAct. As we just saw, there's no value for 1 for the existing harmonized variable, so we don't need to specify how to replace it. We're also going to create a new variable with age categories. So we're going to use egen, which is an enhanced generation command, as compared to gen or generate. So we'll use egen to create a new variable called R7AgeCat, and we'll do this by cutting our current age variable, R7AgeY, at the ages of 55, 65, 75, and 110. This will create 3 age groupings of 55 to 64, 65 to 74, and 75 to 110. And we'll also add a label onto our statement so that it tells us the bottom age in our bracket. So if we go back to Stata, type Q and enter, we'll first create the indicator of weekly vigorous exercise. We've done a tab for R7VigAct and see that everything looks on track. Just about 70% of respondents don't do vigorous exercise weekly, and about 30% do. If we type Q and enter again, we'll create our age category variable, and a tab shows the age breakdown of our sample. Now we're going to apply weights, and one of the helpful things about using Stata is they have a lot of built-in commands for using survey data. One of those commands is called SVY_set, which tells Stata how this complex survey is set up. This allows us to tell Stata how the data is weighted. Here we're using the person-level cross-sectional weight, and we end up with national-level estimates for England. Once we enter this SVY_set command, we don't have to specify these things for every single analysis command that we make from here. Instead, Stata will recall this information. So let's do this inside of Stata. And you can see we use this command called SVY_describe. So we can describe our sample. And you see that we have one strata here representing England with just under 10,000 respondents who participated in Wave 7. So I think before we get into anything more involved, we should first just look at the mean for weekly vigorous physical activity for our sample. So to recall the SVY_set information that we gave Stata about our survey design and how we want our estimates weighted, we're going to say SVY, which tells Stata to recall what it was already told. And we're going to ask for our mean. We're also going to set a subpopulation condition to make sure they're within our age brackets of 55 and older. So if we go back into Stata and run this, we're going to get a mean of 0.27, which is pretty close to our unweighted numbers. So about 27% of the English population aged 55 and older do vigorous exercise at least weekly. But what if we want to look at the average by gender and age category? Then we're going to put over RA gender, R7 age cat after the mean statement. We don't need to provide a subpopulation condition anymore, because by having R7 age cat in the over statement, we're already limiting the age groups in our analysis. So if we go back into Stata and run this command, you'll see that Stata tells us who is in each subpopulation. We can see the mean for weekly vigorous physical activity for our 6 gender and age categories. You can see we also have standard errors and 95% confidence intervals, which can be helpful if you want to know whether these are meaningful differences. But now let's look at the mean for weekly vigorous exercise by gender and age visually. We can see that males tend to do more weekly vigorous physical activity than females do. We can also see that there's a significant decline in the frequency of vigorous exercise once they reach the age of 75. And if we want to test whether our first age group of 55 to 64 is significantly different from our second age group of 65 to 74 for each gender, then we can use a command called test, which is called a post-estimation command, meaning you run it after you've created your estimates. Here we created mean estimates of weekly vigorous exercise by age groups. So if we run this and test for a difference between subpopulation 1, which is our younger age group for men, and subpopulation 2, which is our middle age group for men, Stata will perform an adjusted walled test. We'll see that the probability greater than the F statistic is 0.0025, which is statistically significant. When we run this for women with subpopulations 4 and 5, we get a probability greater than the F statistic of 0.02, which may or may not be statistically significant depending on your alpha level. Now it's time to ask a new question, and that is, how does weekly vigorous physical activity in England compare to weekly vigorous physical activity in other European countries? In order to assess this, we're going to have to append a share dataset to our existing ELSA dataset. To do that, we need to register for share and download several files from the Share Research Data Center. The link can be found on the first row of the download page on g2aging.org. We're also going to download the Harmonized Shares data creation code from the fourth row of the download page. Just so you know, this code was updated last month to account for Share's latest 6.1.1 release. Once we edit the folder locations for where we're storing the original Share data, we can run the Harmonized Share creation code and end up with a Harmonized Share dataset. Then we're going to identify the relevant variables from this dataset. After that, we'll pool our observations from ELSA and Share to create a single analysis dataset. We'll prepare our variables, apply our weights, and finally analyze vigorous physical activities across countries, genders, and age categories. After producing the Harmonized Share, we'll identify the variables we need. We'll use Wave 6 of Share, which happens to have taken place in 2015. The person identifier in Share is merge ID. The frequency of vigorous physical activity is called R6VGACTX. And we have the respondent age, which is called R6AGY. The respondent's gender, called RA gender. We have a country indicator already made, also called ISO country. And finally, our respondent level weight, called R6 weight resp. So we're going to pool our Harmonized ELSA and Harmonized Share datasets together. We're not going to merge them together because there should be nobody in common between these datasets. Instead, we're going to append them, which will put our Share observations below the ELSA observations already in data memory. So we'll append using our Harmonized Share dataset, and we're going to specify that we're going to keep our variables of interest. At the same time, we're going to generate a new variable called study. So this will let us know which dataset our observations belong to. This study variable will automatically be coded as a 0 if it was already in the dataset, so our ELSA data, and as a 1 if we just added it, so our Share data. But we're going to recode this variable so that the 0 will be a 1 and a 1 will be a 2. We're going to define a new label called study name, saying that a 1 means ELSA and a 2 means Share. And we're going to assign this study name label to our study variable. If we continue our program in Stata, you'll see that we've done this and we've typed in a tab for study. We've now added over 120,000 observations from Share to our dataset while keeping our ELSA observations intact. The next step we're going to do is prepare our variables. First, we're going to create an indicator of weekly vigorous physical activity by recoding R6VGACTX in the same way we recoded our Harmonized ELSA variable, and we're going to create a new variable called R6VigAct. Then we're going to create our age categories for Share. If we go ahead and do this within Stata, we can see that the number of people in Share doing vigorous physical activity is almost split 50-50. And we have our new age groupings. The next step we're going to do is give value labels for our country variable. So we're going to define a new label called countries, and we're going to give each country code a label that includes the country's name. So we'll define these for all of the Share countries in Wave 6 and for England. Then we're going to assign these labels to the values in our ISO country variable. So if we type Q here in Stata, we do this and we can see which code corresponds to which country, and we can see their sample sizes. So to further prepare our variables, you may have noticed that the variables from the harmonized datasets contain a wave number, and this is particularly helpful if you're only looking inside of one study. But when you want to compare between different studies and you want to compare the same years, you're most likely going to need to create some new variables to make up for the different waves between studies. So we're going to make some new variables based on the year and not on the wave number. Our first variable will be our 2014 VigAct. So we know that the values will come from R7 VigAct if it's coming from ELSA, marked by study number 1, and from R6 VigAct if it's from SHARE, which is study number 2. So we're also going to take the same steps and create our 2014 AgeCat for our age categories and weight 2014 for our person level weights. So once again, we're creating new variables based on our year of analysis rather than the wave number that contain observations from the ELSA and SHARE datasets. If we type Q here in Stata, we'll create those new variables. And now that we've got those set up, we can move on to our next step. So we're going to apply weights using the SVY set command again, using the combined weight 2014 that we just created. We can also tell Stata how the sample is stratified or clustered. So in this case, we're going to say that our strata is at the country level, since we're now dealing with multiple countries. So our weights refer inside of each strata or each country here, and we can end up with national level estimates for each country. So let's do this inside of Stata. And you can see we've used this SVY describe command again. And you'll see that we now have 19 strata here because we had 18 from SHARE and 1 from ELSA. And there's over 76,000 observations from the 2014-2015 wave for both of these studies. We're going to estimate our mean for weekly vigorous exercise for all of the countries in SHARE and for ELSA. So we're going to include the SVY to recall our earlier command for weighting the data. We're going to limit it to the people within our age categories, and then we're going to ask for the mean of our 2014 VigAct over the countries. So when we do this, you can see that we now have 19 different subpopulations. Since we're looking at vigorous exercise in honor of the FIFA World Cup, we'll look at the other 3 semifinalists in addition to England. We can see the mean for weekly vigorous exercise is about 0.4 for Belgians in our sample, which is subpopulation 2. The mean's about 0.43 for Croatians in our sample, which is subpopulation 3. And if we look at subpopulation 7, which is France, the mean's about 0.36. So let's look at this visually. We can see that some countries, like Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland, seem to be a lot more vigorously active than others, like Italy, Portugal, Spain, and England, while Belgium, Croatia, and France seem to be more in the middle of the pack. And if we want to test whether there's a statistically significant difference between countries, then we can use the test command again. So we'll use the semifinal matchups and see if weekly vigorous exercise in Belgium is different from France and if Croatia is different from England. So if we run this, the result for Belgium versus France with subpopulations 2 and 7 would be significant at most alpha levels. But when we run this for Croatia versus England, subpopulations 3 and 19, we get a probability greater than the F statistic of 0.0000, which is definitely significant. Now we'll add our gender and age category variables in the over part of our command. And we'll obtain an estimate for weekly vigorous physical activity by country, gender, and age. But we're also going to limit it to the countries that we're interested in. To do that correctly, we're going to set a subpopulation condition in the SVY statement. You wouldn't produce correct standard errors if you limit the countries in your analysis after the mean statement. So, in our subpopulation statement, we're saying we're including the countries that have ISO country code values of 56, 191, 250, and 826, which are our codes for Belgium, Croatia, France, and England. So if we do this inside of Stata, we can see the results for these 4 countries by gender and each age grouping. So about 55% of Belgian men aged 55 to 64 get weekly vigorous exercise, and only about 10% of English women aged 75 to 110 get weekly vigorous exercise. Now let's look at a graph of this. Just as we noticed for England, men generally appear to be more active than women, though it may not be statistically different. And there is a definite decline in the level of vigorous physical activity for people aged 75 and older in all of these countries. For men aged 55 to 64, it looks like Croatia is the most vigorously active, followed very closely by France and Belgium, with England quite a bit lower. For women in this age range, Croatia is still the most vigorously active, but almost tied with Belgium and followed by France and England. We can also see that the difference between men and women is smaller for Belgium and Croatia than it is for France and England. And if we want to test whether there's a statistically significant difference between men and women for ages 55 to 64 in these countries, then we're going to use the test command again. This will involve subpopulations 1 and 4 for Belgium, 7 and 10 for Croatia, 13 and 16 for France, and 19 and 22 for England. When we enter this command, we get a probability of 0.14 for Belgium, 0.0099 for Croatia, and 0.0000 for France and England. So we can say that there is no statistically significant difference in weekly vigorous physical activity for men and women aged 55 to 64 in Belgium, but there are statistically significant differences in Croatia, France, and England. So that's going to wrap things up. If you have any questions or comments, visit us at g2aging.org or email our help desk at help@g2aging.org. We try to get back to you within about 24 hours from this help email. We can help if you have specific questions about a harmonized dataset, or if you're having difficulty finding something or in just figuring out how to get started.